the nootropic?
So the word nootropic is not precisely defined in a way that everyone uses it commonly, but for the most part, we can define nootropic as some chemical that enhances some aspect of cognitive ability beyond normal baseline without meaningful side effects. And so if we're dealing with someone's cognitive capability having dropped below baseline, we're dealing with pathology of some kind, even if it's subclinical pathology, right? Alzheimer's is cognitive decline from a pathology that we've defined very clearly. Brain fog is generally not a clearly defined pathology, but it is actually dysfunction. So if we are correcting the underlying dysfunction to just come back to baseline, that's very meaningful. We would call that kind of medicine in the psychoneuropharmacology and the cognitive chemistry space. And it's not medicine that's well understood or well defined, but that wouldn't be nootropics per se, even though a lot of people use nootropics for that space. Nootropics are really looking at optimization beyond baseline. How can I take some capacity and enhance it? Now then you have smart drugs. So people who use Adderall not for prescription purposes for an actual diagnosed dysfunction, but are using it for enhancement, and it will enhance something, whether it's Adderall that they're using or Ritalin or Modafinil or Wellbutrin or just lots of Red Bull.
Red Bull's a smart drug.
You could think of it that way, right? Most of the time when we think smart drug, we think pharmaceuticals. Some pharmaceutical that's usually for narcolepsy or ADD or some other kind of actual cognitive decline disorder like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. People use levodopa, right, as a Parkinson's med for increasing dopamine, different things like that. So we usually think of some kind of pharma med that is being used for an off-label purpose for enhancing some aspect of cognitive function. And that does work, but usually it works at the cost of both long-term dependency, long-term side effects, and usually even fairly narrow upregulation with some real-time downregulation. So when people are taking dopamine, for instance, they're seeking to increase dopamine production, but they're not looking at how natural dopamine production and dopamine regulation works. And so we don't want dopamine relatively fixed from outside stimulus. We want dopamine to be able to be adaptive to external stimulus as is appropriate and adaptive to all of the other chemicals that it exists in quite complex relationships with serotonin, with GABA, with the other catecholamines, right? And we also want to look at the whole chain of how dopamine is produced to say, if that chain is damaged somewhere, right? The person is not getting enough tyrosine or phenylalanine, or they don't have enough of the vitamins that are involved in converting it, B6 or C or et cetera, then that can affect other things. So dopamine might be the most obvious, but if it's a tyrosine issue, it might be affecting thyroid function, right? So not only do we not want to just go straight to the in-chain chemical and make them not adaptive, but we don't want to lose the opportunity to optimize the entire chain for all of those purposes. And so smart drugs are not nootropics, though they're people who are interested are oftentimes interested in both. What we're interested in the nootropic space, and we specifically have an approach to nootropics that is a complex system-informed approach to nootropics, is how do we optimize some aspects of cognitive psychological function sustainably, where we don't have meaningful side effects in real time, like Adderall increasing focus but creating irritability or anxiety.
And also addictive properties as well, right?
That would be a long-term downside. The short-term downside would be being anxious or irritable while you're on it, or having empathy go down, or having digit span go down while focus goes up. So our goal, when we saw Adderall doing something like multi-billion-dollar sales off-label, right? Off-label purposes for people doing their tech startup or midterms or finals, or with all the consequences associated. And we saw this exponential curve, and not just on that, but on a lot of smart drugs and on a $15 billion energy drink market. And it's clear that people have radically increased demands on their cognitive ability.
We are slaves right now to notifications. Calendar is being chock full. I look at my brother's life. I love my brother. He has 3 kids and he has a full-time job and he's doing all these things. And I look at him at the end of the day and he's drinking coffee and I'm like, there's got to be a better way. Because he is a mirror of the consciousness level and of the aptitude that's out there right now about people not really knowing what they can do to let some steam off and to refocus their attention. So I had an experience that I want to share, and it was 6 weeks. Your company was nice enough to give me a great supply, and it was incredible. I took a black label product, which is not on the market yet. But what happened is that I woke up in the morning, I did my meditation, I went through my normal process, and then I'm at CES, 8 podcast interviews in one day, and going on stage to moderate a panel and an after party. And at the end of the day, I was still thinking like, wow, I could actually connect with more people. And never in my life have I been able to be so focused in the same way that I'm feeling you right now, where I'm fully present. I'm looking into someone's eyes. There's no response in me where I need to look away or check my phone or not be here. And that's something that's unique. So beyond just the physical energy that I was feeling, I mean, what is that product? Tell us about Qualia. Tell us what I was using to be able to have that incredible day.
So the first thing that we looked at was, as we were saying, we see this exponential rise in products that people are taking to enhance some aspect of productive capability or focus or energy or clarity, even if it is down-regulating other things that matter, even if it's causing dependence because the demand is so high, right? The need is so high. So as you're mentioning with your brother and so many people, there are more things causing distraction and competing for focus while an increased demand for productivity. And the net result of those together is very stressful, debilitating, etc. So most people know if they take caffeine, they can have increase in certain kinds of focus. But if they take it above a certain level, they're going to get then downsides, anxiety, jitters. And they still, if they actually pay attention and say they use Quantified Mind or Cambridge Online Cognitive Assessment or tools like that, Quantified Self tools, they'll see that some metrics of cognitive capability increase and other ones actually decrease in real time, right? So we've seen times where people have a lot more energy, but they're actually task switching so fast that their follow-through is poor or things like that, right? So the first thing we did was we said, all right, so people who are buying off-label Adderall or smart drinks or whatever it is, what are they actually really looking for? And what they're looking for most of the time is not just increased arithmetic processing or increased verbal fluency or increased digit span, but they're looking for creative, productive flow states where their cognitive capacities and their creative capacities are fully online and they have the right emotional state that goes along with that. So cognitively, there's a whole set of functions. It's short-term memory and long-term memory and speed of memory and digit span and verbal fluency and task switching and depth of focus and attention span, right? It's all these classic cognitive metrics, but it's the product of those together, right? None of them on their own. And we actually really want to look at how do we lift all those together, along with more internal drive and internal agency and more emotional resilience to disruptive external, phenomena.
Creating almost a virtual buffer around distraction and things that want to pull you out of that state, whether it be flow state or just focused attention.
Exactly.
There's 42 compounds and they all work together in synergy. And if we have time at the end of the show, we'll talk about how synergy and the emergence process work. But the synergy of 42 ingredients. I've taken 4 brands of nootropics actually in the past 2 years. And what I loved the most about Qualia is that I could go all day long, but still not feel that crash. And I think people can relate to this if they've had too much coffee in a day, that feeling of being jittery towards the end of the day. It didn't occur. So how did you design that? How do these chemicals work together? Or they're not really chemicals, right? They're more things that are essential for us that our body needs. There's some brain vitamins in there. Tell us about those.
We started by modeling what we were trying to enhance. And as you were mentioning, it was actually a lot of things that are not necessarily obvious at first, right? Like increased presence isn't necessarily what people think of when they're going for a nootropic and they think they want increased focus, because oftentimes increased focus will lead to irritability if someone tries to distract them. So how do we have, this is a common Adderall thing, it's like if I'm just coding, it's cool, but if someone distracts me, I'm irritable and I actually have a hard time task switching. How do we have more focus and more fluid task switching and more presence wherever we are, while enough perspective to then decide where we want to move our attention back to? That's a lot of complex functions together. So we started by doing the cognitive and psychological modeling of what we were actually seeking to enhance, the whole set of functions and experiences, and then how those relate to each other. Once we had that modeled, and that's novel, right? We didn't start with, here's a disease state, and here's the one thing that we're going to try and adjust in that disease state, or even here's an optimization goal, and here's the one thing. We started with a synergistic goal. Then we said, let's look at, since we're not modifying it via a meditation practice, which is totally valid, or a psychotherapeutic practice, CBT or something like that, we're modifying it via modifying the underlying...
What is CBT for people that might not know?
Cognitive behavioral therapy, particular kind of effective psychotherapy for certain things. We're very technology agnostic, by the way. We work with biochemistry. We work with neurotechnology, so transcranial stimulation of various kinds, transcranial lasers, magnetic deep stim, electric stim, AC/DC, etc.
Neurofeedback as well.
Neurofeedback, gut-brain axis work, genomics and genetic expression work, as well as psychological modalities, from mindfulness meditative modalities to underlying shifting of meaning, trauma, somatic therapies. We're interested in anything that actually works on some dynamics, then being able to know which things are going to be most meaningful for an individual person and their goals. We'll get back to that. But for this generalized purpose, what we were looking for is, once we understood what psychological and cognitive functions we're seeking to optimize, we wanted to see what physiology mediates those. And so this is looking at everything from the cell science and the neurochemistry, neuroendocrinology, biophysics, what's known about all the things that have causal relationships to short-term memory or to emotional resilience, right? So we look at all the pathways where some studies have happened. So we started with a structured review, meta-analysis of all the appropriate spaces to say, okay, acetylcholine processing affects these things. Glutamate processing affects these things. These ion channels are involved in, right? So then we end up having all these underlying physiologic pathways, and then we model how those pathways, the entire pathway and the regulatory process of those pathways work and how the pathways interact with each other to create these complex feedback mechanisms, which is why we're taking a complex systems approach to neuroscience and psychoneuropharmacology. Once we modeled that out, we said, all right, we want to actually enhance not just the level of some chemical, right, raise acetylcholine, but we want to enhance the regulatory capacity of this whole system so that when someone gets off it, they don't have dependence because we've just created a big exogenous stimuli and now they're dependent on it. But our exogenous stimuli was actually working through their endogenous, their internal regulatory pathway to robust the resilience of that regulatory pathway so when they get off it, the effects can be lasting. So then we looked at how does the entire regulatory pathway work and what can we do to be able to increase the capacity of that system.
I'm almost hearing from you this was an inventory of everything that works to make our cognition fire. Now, would you say that nootropics decrease the time from one synapse to the other that the message gets through, or is this more making it a folding of the safety of the axon and the neuron? What is it actually doing with the nootropic in there between that space, between the dendrite and everything? What's happening there?
Different things. So say you just look at acetylcholine, right? That one neurotransmitter for a moment. You can use something like huperzine A, which is a very common nootropic, which is what we call an acetylcholine esterase inhibitor.
Which was in the 4-Hour Body, right? Didn't Tim Ferriss write about that quite a bit?
Probably.
Yeah.
It's a common nootropic. It's a plant-derived nootropic. There are other things that are also acetylcholine esterase inhibitors, both pharmaceutical and plant-based. And what that's doing is there's an enzyme in the synapse. So you're talking about between the axon and the dendrite, right? In the synaptic cleft, there's an enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine so you don't have excessive amounts of it. But it can also break it down too fast so you then end up having deficient amounts.
Would that cause brain fog if it's too fast in the breakdown?
It can, right? But it's important. Brain fog doesn't have one cause. It has lots of causes. It can be from neuroinflammation. It can be from deficiency or excess of lots of different neurotransmitters. So, but that could be one of them. So you can actually inhibit that enzyme so the same amount of acetylcholine that is coming out of the axon can actually get across the synapse more effectively. That's one thing you could do if you're asking what's happening chemically. So an acetylcholine esterase inhibitor would be one way to modulate the acetylcholine pathway. But once it gets across the synapse, it's going to be actually getting uptaken in the postsynaptic neuron in various receptors. And so we could modulate one of those receptors. So we can use things like racetams, piracetam, aniracetam, et cetera, to upregulate, say, the acetylcholine uptake on the NMDA complex. That's another thing that we could do. And we could do those in combination or separately. We could actually provide more choline donors or acetyl donors for the body to make more acetylcholine. We could provide the catalysts like vitamin B5 and other things that help take choline and acetylate it. So there's a lot of things that we can do to affect the acetylcholine pathway. And that's just one pathway then.
There's 2 stages. Why taking the first stage without food and then waiting and then food with the second stage? I had to play around with a bit to find my perfect dose to where I could just be present, but then not feel like I was too much energized. Tell us about that, why you break it up into 2. I've never done that before.
Okay, so Qualia currently has 2 bottles. It's a program that someone would take. Just for clarity, when we were initially modeling what are all of the chemicals that we know something meaningful about that could modify any of those underlying pathways, we created a database of about 500 chemicals and looked at what the primary pathways they affect, secondary pathways, et cetera. And then we did a whole bunch of customized chemistry for this kind of cognitive enhancement goal, where we were working with integrative doctors, running very deep blood chemistry on people, clinical chemistry, brain scans, genomics, et cetera, and then really working to optimize in very unique ways. Once we saw that we could get the kinds of effects we wanted to get, really profound upregulation across all the things they were interested in without any of the kinds of downregulation we wanted to avoid that we could assess, then we wanted to see what portion of that could we do in a non-customized fashion so that we could bring it at scale. Because obviously doing it, that kind of customization at scale is very difficult. And there's some things that we couldn't work with because they're so specific to one set of genes that what would be beneficial for someone is too harmful to other people. But we wanted to see which dynamics can we work with effectively across most of the population. So then that looked like a bunch of internal product development, trials, iterations.
We're using 23andMe tests as well?
That was one of the things. Some people were giving us 23andMe data. Some people were giving us Illumina data. Some people were going much deeper into also looking at what's actually expressing. But we're also, of course, just doing the analysis of all of the journal articles in various spaces and doing, structured synthesis. So the 42 is one iteration. It's one iteration that ended up being the right one for us to come to market with first, but it's going to change soon. The reason it was two different things, two different products, is specifically some of the ingredients absorb very well without food. Since these are pills that people are swallowing, we could have things that were injections, IM or IV or intranasal, but there's safety and regulatory reasons.
It'd be hard to sell needles as well, yeah.
And we don't have any moral issue with that if it's actually safe and effective. We're just simply looking at what the safest way for things to go to the most number of people for the most enhancement can happen. And so since we're having to do GI absorption, then some things really absorb much better without food, where they get to have maximum surface area contact. Other things really need food for absorption and to avoid nausea. And so in the particular stack of chemicals we were working with, we ended up separating it for that purpose.
Yeah, one of the things you have on your site that's fascinating is you're quoted, "We believe fully optimized human beings lead to a better world, people being productive and creative in whatever that is theirs to do. But in many ways, our modern world works against us." How do you feel like Neurohacker? Tell us about Neurohacker and what are you doing to address that, to address the onslaught of these weapons of mass distraction, as Gay and Katie Hendricks call it?
Well, regarding the quote that you mentioned from our website and why Neurohacker exists is obviously we're working on individual human optimization. How can we optimize our mind, brain, body system for increased quality of experience and increased capability? And we're interested in both. Increasing our quality of experience means less subjective suffering, more subjective happiness, quality of life, right? That's important because human experience is intrinsically meaningful. And increasing human capability and positive predisposition to solve problems and create things of meaning ends up affecting the experience of lots of other people and non-people sentient things, right? And so if our focus is increasing the quality of sentient experience across everything, then optimizing humans ends up being key to that whole process, because most of the problems in the world that we really care to change, whether we're talking about economic inequality or war or crime or species extinction, those are problems that are being caused by human action. And human action is motivated by our worldview. It's motivated by economic systems that predispose certain actions. It's motivated by lots of things, but one of the things that ends up motivating it is our own biology. And so when we realize that empathy runs on certain neural networks, it can be biochemically up or down regulated. Complex thinking requires certain kinds of hardware, right? Neurophysiologic hardware interactions to occur. Everyone who's had their hormones very out of place or who's been sick or very underslept knows that you can go into biochemical states that make certain emotions or certain cognitive capabilities almost inaccessible and that make other ones almost unavoidable.
Yeah.
And so while addressing human physiology is not sufficient for optimizing human experience and capability, it is necessary.